out to Kids Church. Have a blast. I know. Trade. Thank you much.
Thank you, kids. Enjoy imagining. Well, this summer, we are in a sermon series called Bless. And Bless is a series, it's an invitation for us to think differently, to think creatively, to imagine differently about evangelism. Because I think a lot of times we think about evangelism as going and telling people about God. But we want to kind of invite you to imagine, to be curious with God, in a different way, that what if evangelism is going out to bless our community? And what if it's as we're going out to bless our community, we are then blessed in the process of sharing the love of Jesus with our neighbors and with our friends? And so as we are kind of entering into this series this summer, Pastor Britta last week, she started us off with beginning with prayer. And she talked about this idea that there is nothing that can separate us from the love of God. There is nothing that can separate us from the love of God. And that Jesus is actually interceding on our behalf. That God desires good things for God's good people. And so God desires goodness for people. And so that God is actually in the process, that Jesus is in the process of praying for people. And so our invitation to pray alongside others, to pray for others, is this invitation into the heart of God, into what God desires, the goodness that God desires for the people in our life. Beautiful, beautiful. And so as we were talking about this morning and thinking about kind of part 2 of this begin with prayer, let me clarify this. I forgot I didn't do this. BLESS is an acronym, for those of you who don't know. BLESS stands for begin with prayer, listen with care, eat together, serve and love, and share your story. And so it's a way in which we seek to bless and be blessed in the process of sharing the love of Jesus with our neighbors. And so as I was thinking about this morning, how should we begin with prayer? It made sense to me that, we would pray. Right, that we would actually begin with prayer. And so our sermon this morning is going to look a little bit differently. I'm going to give a shorter reflection this morning, not terribly short, but shorter for me, so only an hour long. It will be shorter than that, I promise. And then Pastor Britta is actually going to lead us in a prayer practice. And she's going to lead us in praying for people in our life, something we sometimes call intercession. Now, I recognize this can sometimes be a little bit like, ooh, that's a lot. Right? Because praying for someone, like, how do we do this? And what does exactly that look like? And I don't know if I feel like I can do that because I don't know how to pray, or I don't know. And Pastor Britta, so beautifully with our kids, she invited them into this practice of imagining, of being curious with God. She's going to lead us with that a little bit later, so we'll have an extended time of praying for people. But because I kind of knew what this morning was going to hold, or had some intention about entering in as a community praying for people, I asked Lindsay, who's in charge of our prayer partners, I asked her, I said, would you be willing to have our prayer partners pray for our time this morning? So it's a little bit of this like intercession inception, right? Praying for the prayer time. And so our prayer partners, they have been praying for our time this morning. They've been praying for what God is doing and stirring in our lives and how we might be invited to pray. And so this word intercession is kind of a big word, and I so appreciate this about Lindsay. She just said, I want to ask you, kind of as you're praying and coming before God, asking God what God has for this time, I want to invite you, what does intercession mean to you? How would you define intercession? And so I want to read some of these definitions for you this morning because I think they're a helpful frame for us to kind of maybe de-escalate what can sometimes feel a little bit overwhelming or like, I don't know if I can do that. So here are some definitions. This one was, the majority of people said some version of this definition, our prayer partners. They said, intercessory prayer is simply standing before or with God on behalf of someone or something else outside of me. Beautiful, right? Intercessory prayer is simply standing before or with God on behalf of someone or something else outside of me. This is another response. The definition of intercede literally means to go between, and often it is connected with resolving conflict or hostility. Jesus is the ultimate intercessor who goes between the Father and us while we were yet sinners. As those who have been reconciled and are being reconciled to God, we can now be intercessors between God and those in our lives who are not yet reconciled with God. Beautiful. And this last one, I just love this. I'm all for spending time with God and discovering God's agenda for that time and praying for the things God brings to mind. I love this idea God caring so deeply and passionately about things that God invites me in. Beautiful. And I think this is sometimes, we sometimes can have a tendency to kind of feel overwhelmed or feel like, oh, this is just so much to try to pray for someone. I don't know what to pray. I don't know how to do this. And I think this invitation is that God has a desire. God desires the goodness for God's people. And so our invitation is to be invited into what God is up to come alongside the heart of God and to be praying for those in our life. And so that's what we're going to do this morning, is we're going to kind of come into this invitation of seeking to be curious with God. What is God up to in the lives of the people that matter to us? And how can we be invited to pray for them? And so the passage we're going to be looking at this morning to kind of frame this, to frame how we approach intercession or praying for others, comes from Luke chapter 11. Now, you may not have the Bible memorized. I don't. So Luke chapter 11 actually talks about the prayer that Jesus taught his disciples to pray. So if you've been in the church before, you've been kind of around in Christian faith, you've maybe heard this, the Lord's Prayer, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. So that is the prayer that Jesus introduces in chapter 11 of Luke. But I don't know if you know this or not, but Jesus kept talking. I mean, Jesus talked a lot, right? Like there's a lot of things that Jesus said. But for some reason, it never occurred to me that as the disciples asked Jesus how to pray, Jesus doesn't just give them the Lord's Prayer, he keeps talking. I don't know why I'd never realized that, but this is what happens. So if you have your Bible with you, I want to invite you to take it out, to turn to Luke chapter 11. If you don't, you can pull it up on your phone. There are Bibles in the pew or the chairs in front of you. The words will also be on the screen, but I think it's helpful to kind of see like, oh, like Jesus keeps talking. Like this is continuing the teaching on how to pray. And specifically, I think it's helpful for us to think about how Jesus is teaching the people how to pray in the context of praying for others or of an intercession. So this is Luke chapter 11, beginning in verse 5. So Jesus has taught his disciples to pray the Lord's Prayer. Then Jesus said to them, "Suppose you have a friend and you go to him at midnight and say, 'Friend, lend me 3 loaves of bread. A friend of mine on a journey has come to me and I have no food to offer him.' And suppose the one inside answers, 'Don't bother me, the door's already locked and my children and I are in bed. I can't give up and give you anything.' I tell you, even though he will not get up and give you the bread because of friendship, yet because of your shameless audacity, he will surely get up and give you as much as you need. So I say to you, ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, the one who seeks finds, and to the one who knocks, the door will be opened. Which of you fathers, if your son asks for a fish, will give him a snake instead? Or if he asks for an egg, will give him a scorpion? If you then, though you are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give the Holy Spirit to those who ask him?" The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Now, this passage in particular, again had never occurred to me. This is what Jesus keeps saying after he teaches the Lord's Prayer. Excuse me. And so I kind of got curious with God this week about this passage. Like there's some things in here that are like, oh, this is kind of piques my curiosity. What exactly is happening? And so the parable that Jesus gives is that a man goes and talks to this friend, a father, he's referred to as a father. He talks to this friend about kind of as an example, a parallel for how we would understand prayer. So the first thing I kind of was curious about is, what does the man ask for? What does he ask for? Bread. Bread, how great is that? Why does he ask for bread? Because he has guests to give it to his friends. I was like, no way. This is so powerful. That Jesus is teaching his disciples to pray is to go to God asking for bread for our friends. Asking for friends. What is that? Is not a word. Asking for bread for our friends. As we've been talking about in Bless, these Francs are our friends, our relatives, our acquaintances, our neighbors, our coworkers, and our classmates, that we can go to God asking for bread. I love that this is what Jesus does. This is how Jesus teaches the people to pray. And I was thinking about that. I love this so much because as Pastor Britta introduced this kind of Bless series for the summer, she talked about bread. And she talked about bless, these B-L-E-S-S, as elements of a recipe of baking good bread. And that was an analogy of the good news of Jesus, and that we seek to bake this good bread of Jesus, the good news of God, and we break that bread and we share the goodness of God with our community. And so how beautiful is it that as Jesus is teaching his disciples how to pray, he says, go and ask for bread for your friends. Now, another curiosity I had as I was thinking about this passage is he goes and asks for 3 loaves of bread. And so I did a little bit more research because I'm curious about this. So in those days, bread was an essential kind of staple for your daily diet. It was a part of fulfilling your kind of stomach needs, right? You just had to eat. And so typically what would happen is a household would cook bread in the morning to kind of cover for all of their daily needs. They would cook this bread at the beginning of the day. And a typical household, how many loaves of bread do you think a typical household would cook each day? 3. So a typical household would cook 3 loaves of bread to meet their daily needs. Just before this, Jesus has taught his disciples how to pray, and he says, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. And I was like, again, like this is just so cool to me that Jesus is teaching his disciples to go and ask for bread. And what this person is going to ask God, who is represented here as this friend, this father, is to go and ask for the daily bread, to provide for the daily needs of this person's friend. I was just like, this is so powerful. And it's not just like he's asking for the moldy leftovers, right? Like, oh, there's some gross bread in the corner. Let me go grab some for you. No. What Jesus does is he compares this kind of individual who's supposed to be kind of related to God, and to say that this person, like, he's kind of quirky. We're going to find that out in just a second. This guy's kind of quirky. God isn't quirky. God isn't like, he's a good God. And so then this other part where it talks about how many of you fathers, if you were asked for a fish, would give him a snake, or eggs or a scorpion. Like, what is that about? He's making a really obvious statement. Like, if we as humans know how to give good gifts, how much more does God want to give these good gifts? How much more does God desire to give this good bread? And so when Jesus is teaching his disciples to pray, he's saying, go and ask God, go and ask the Father for good bread to meet the daily needs of your friends. Whoa. What a beautiful picture of what it looks like for us to pray for other people. A beautiful picture of intercession, to go and ask God for good bread for our friends. Now, there's another curiosity about this passage for me, and that was kind of the man's response. Right, he knocked at the door and asked for these 3 loaves of bread, this daily bread, this good bread to feed his friends. And the father says, I'm already in bed, and the door's locked. No thanks. Right, like, that's curious. And so, again, Jesus is setting up that this is a human person, and God is far more, like, gracious than that. But I was curious about this, so I did a little bit more research. And immediately as I heard about this, that God is talking about this father who's kind of disrupted, I immediately thought of my own context, right? And so in our home, we have 3 bedrooms, and they're all upstairs. And we have a downstairs where our front door is, and the kitchen, right? We have a pretty large, like, home, like, relatively compared. In those days, in the ancient Near East, they didn't have these really big houses, right? They didn't have, like, all of these separate rooms and all this different stuff. And so more than likely, most people in that time, in their home, had, like, one main living space. And it might have been partitioned into a couple of different places, but for the most part, they had one kind of main living space. And so at nighttime, when they would go to bed, most often they would have a sleeping mat that they would roll out, and the whole family would fall asleep on this mat. Right, so I had in my head this different context of, like, well, someone knocked at our door, like, I would just go down and it wouldn't disrupt my family. Right, but at this time, for this person to get up is to, like, get up and disrupt their whole family. And it's not like they had this really big house with all of these different bedrooms. They had one main room. So even if they're not going to wake up their family by getting up and kind of very, sneakily walking off the mat or whatever, the kitchen isn't downstairs. It's like, I'm in the kitchen, right? So the people are all sleeping right here on the mat. I'm going to get up and make some bread. Like, do you think making bread, stoking a fire, kneading the dough isn't going to wake up all of the people sitting right next to you? Right? This is disruptive. And so when they're baking this bread, this is a disruptive thing to the household. And one commentator, they made this point too. They said that in those days, most houses also didn't have like these really big yards, right? It's not like you had this like kind of miles of sand with a nice water feature out front, right? Like you were typically in a community, in a city, and so your houses were all stacked next to each other. In a lot of different places, you actually shared a wall with your neighbors, right? And so if you're going to get up in the middle of the night and start stoking a fire and baking this bread, rolling these out, the sounds are going to kind of start to reverberate beyond your own home. And not only that, but kind of as the bread starts to bake, these fresh smells are going to kind of permeate the community. And so this one commentator made this image that just captivated me this week, is that for this person to go and make this request for good bread for their friends had the potential of stirring up the whole community. What an incredible picture for us of intercession, of what it means for us to pray for others. That when we go to God with this request for good bread for our neighbors, for our friends, there is the potential that it will stir up our whole community. That we will all be kind of spurred on into action to be kind of involved in finding out what is going on, what is God up to in meeting the needs of these people in our lives. It's just such a beautiful image for me. And so then there's this last curiosity that I had. And it's what Jesus says in response to what's going on here in this story. So if you look with me in Luke chapter 11 and verse 8, this is what Jesus says. He says, I tell you, even though he will not get up, this is the father now, the friend who's been requested by the friend, he will not get up and give you the bread because of friendship, yet because of your shameless audacity, he will surely get up and give you as much as you need. Not because of friendship, but because of your shameless audacity. And so I got curious with God, because that seems like very counter to me. Like I think when I go to God in prayer, it has a lot to do with my friendship, a lot to do with my relationship with God. And here Jesus is saying, it is not because of friendship, but because of your shameless audacity. And so as I was wondering with God, this kind of curiosity came to mind. I'm not certain of this, but I at least wonder in part, is Jesus saying here, the quality of your relationship with God does not determine the effectiveness of your prayer? Now, do we most certainly develop a deeper and richer prayer life the longer we are with God, the longer we seek to follow Jesus, the more we spend time with God, the deeper and richer our relationship becomes? Absolutely. But right here, Jesus says, it isn't because of friendship, but it's because of your shameless audacity that God responds to your request. And so for me, I think this was an invitation to kind of de-escalate a little bit, because I can sometimes feel like I am not good enough or holy enough to talk to God. I don't feel like I have enough of my faith journey stocked to be able to go and make a request of God. And here what Jesus is saying is when you go and you request good bread for your neighbors, there's the potential that this will stir up your whole community. And as the whole community is stirred up, it is not because of the friendship with this person, but because of your shameless audacity. And so I've really wrestled with this a lot this week, because I've been like, what does shameless audacity even mean? Like, what is that about? And so I've really wrestled, because I've been thinking, like, is it that we just have the utmost confidence? Is it just that this everything we just know is going to go according to plan? What's really kind of messed me up this week is this ask, seek, and knock, right? Like, ask and it will be, you'll receive. I'm like, but I have gone to God in prayer before asking and I haven't received. I don't understand. And so I think the invitation to coming to God with shameless audacity is coming to God even when our own shame can sometimes pull us away from God. Right? Because I was thinking, what about this man is shamelessly audacious? He goes and he talks to this man and he says, I don't have what I need. I don't have enough bread. I'm not able to meet the needs of my neighbor. I need help. And you see, I think shame tells us if we don't have enough, we just have to figure it out for ourselves. If we can't figure this out, then it's our problem. And kind of the shameless audacity of this person, I think, is going to God and saying, I don't have what I need. I need help meeting the needs of my friends. I need help fulfilling our daily needs. I need help finding good bread. And so I've wondered for us, I wonder if shameless audacity for us in coming to God is a willingness to come to God even in spite of our shame, in the things that keep us from going to God. And I've thought about that, that our insecurities, our fears, our doubts, our feeling of inadequacy, that we would still shamelessly, audaciously come to God, hoping and trusting that God hears us as we enter into prayer. Now, I really have to be transparent with you. I have wrestled a lot lately with shame-filled timidity. I've wrestled a lot with shame-filled timidity. Feeling like I am just so insecure. Do I have anything to offer? Are the words that I'm going to say this morning, does this matter to anybody? Have I made the right decision? Have I entered into this well? Have I listened to God well? Have I done these kinds of things? And so I have been riddled with shame-filled timidity, the opposite of shameless audacity. And I have been, it has allowed my thinking to kind of become diluted and clouded. I need help. I can't do this by myself. I needed to come to God and ask for daily bread, for good bread for myself and for our community. I couldn't do it by myself. I can't do it by myself. As I was thinking about how to enter into this time of prayer, which we're moving to in just a moment, my shame-filled timidity kind of was speaking pretty loudly. And so as I thought about, okay, what should we do for kind of offering prayers for people, I came up with this really complicated process. We were going to share prayers out loud, and then I was going to guide you through a liturgy, and then you were going to kind of have some time to pray, and then there were going to be prayer stations. I mean, it was complicated. And I was talking to Lindsay, our prayer partner leader, about this, and she said, oh, okay. She received me very graciously. But she said, maybe, what if you considered the desire that sometimes in prayer we need to come to God first? Right? We need to be present to God and kind of come and be invited into the heart of God, what God is doing. And so then I overcorrected, right? I kind of got this really mystical idea. And I was like, here's what we're going to do. I'm not going to say anything, and we're just going to sit in silence for 20 minutes. And I'm just going to trust that God is going to do what God is going to do. Now, I have to be honest. I think coming to God in silence for 20 minutes is actually really powerful, and God does meet us in those spaces. But in thinking about interceding for people or praying for others, that's not it, right? It's the opposite. I went too far to the opposite direction. And I think when we think about praying for people, we have a tendency to do this, right? We overcomplicate the process. And so then it feels like this really big, insurmountable mountain. I don't know how to do that. I don't have the ability to figure that out. That's really complicated. I can't do that. Or we go the opposite direction and we over-mystify things. Well, God, you're just going to have to give it to me. I'm just going to sit here and just wait, and you're going to give it to me. Sometimes God does that. But in the context of our daily living, our daily needs, that doesn't feel like meeting a daily need to me. That feels like this mystical idea. And so I think this invitation to shameless audacity is coming to God simply asking for good bread for our neighbors, to meet our daily needs, to break this good bread of the good news of God, to share the goodness of God with our community. Now, that might seem kind of overly simplistic or overly that's kind of woo-woo, but I think there's something about this of coming to God, asking for our daily needs that we can't meet ourselves, and to not allow our shame-filled timidity keep us from coming to God, because this person shows up. You see, when it said that they ask, seek, and knock, it's not like they're just asking, seeking, and knocking for a bike, right? They're asking and seeking and knocking for good bread for their neighbors. And so I think that the invitation for us to come and to approach God with shameless audacity is to come and to talk to God asking for good bread. Fresh bread. Bread for the journey for us and our friends and our relatives, our acquaintances, our neighbors, our classmates, and our coworkers. And so as I was processing this with Pastor Britta this week, she asked a really great question to me that just totally reframed, and I said, this is what I think we should do. She said, what if you were to get curious with God? What if you got curious with God about what's going on in your own life? And then kind of from that place, what if you were curious with God about the people in your life? Trusting that God is at work. God desires good bread. God desires God's goodness for God's people. So why would we not get curious with God about where God is leading, about how God is moving? And so this invitation, as she talked about this, was just such a gift to me. And it's a tool, right? Because I think sometimes I overcomplicate things or I overmystify things. And so this prayer practice that she kind of encouraged me and invited me to think about was demystifying and uncomplicating. It was simply coming before God, getting curious about the people in our life and what we might be invited to pray for them, how we might be invited to bless them with this good bread. And so as we move to this kind of extended time of prayer, I'm going to invite Pastor Scott to come forward. And he's just going to play some simple music for us, because I know for me, I love silence. I know for others, they hate silence. And so we're just going to have some kind of reflective music that's playing under the background. And in just a moment, Pastor Britta is going to come forward, and she's going to lead us with some of these guiding questions of getting curious with God about what God is up to in the lives of our people, and how God might be inviting us to participate in that goodness and sharing the goodness of God with our community. And so as we do that, I want to invite you to get comfortable, to kind of settle in a little bit. You may not feel like praying this morning, and that's just fine. But I still think that God has something for us. I think God desires something for us. And so I want to invite you to settle in. Perhaps it's closing your eyes, perhaps keeping your hands open, focusing on your breathing, really feeling that you're present in the room. To kind of come with this shameless audacity of being willing to come and knock, to come before God. I'm going to pray this prayer to center us. Now, O Lord, calm me into a quietness that heals and listens, and mold my longings and passions, my wounds and my wanderings into a more holy and human shape. Take just a moment to center yourself and focus on your breath.